I always thought my life with Clara was a quiet masterpiece, a canvas painted with steady routines and unspoken trust. We'd been married 12 years, living in a sprawling Victorian house on the edge of town, the kind with creaky floors and windows that rattled in the wind. I'm a structural engineer, methodical by nature, someone who finds comfort in blueprints and load-bearing walls. Clara, though, she was the artist, a freelance illustrator with a wild streak I'd fallen for back in college. Her auburn hair always smelled faintly of lavender, and her laugh could fill a room like sunlight. We didn't have kids, not for lack of trying, but we'd settled into a rhythm that felt uniquely ours. Or so I believed. It started with the late nights. She'd begun taking on more projects, she said, deadlines that kept her hunched over her drafting table until the early hours. I'd wake to an empty bed, stumble downstairs, and find her sketching, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Just a big commission," she'd murmur, barely looking up. I'd nod, kiss her forehead, and shuffle back to sleep, trusting her completely. Clara wasn't the type to lie, not my Clara. But then the phone calls started. Short, hushed conversations she'd take in the backyard, her voice too low for me to catch. When I asked, she'd shrug and say it was a client, some eccentric type who preferred late-night chats. I didn't press. I'm not a jealous man by nature. The first crack in my trust came on a Tuesday in late October. I'd come home early from a site inspection, my boots still caked with mud, and found the house empty. No note, no text, just her car gone and her studio untouched, pencils scattered like she'd left in a hurry. I called her, but it went straight to voicemail. Hours later, she breezed in, cheeks flushed, claiming she'd been at a gallery downtown, meeting a new client. "You should have told me," I said, keeping my tone light. She smiled, apologetic, and promised to be better. But something lingered in her eyes, something guarded. I brushed it off. Marriage is about faith, isn't it? You don't build a life together only to tear it apart over suspicions. Weeks passed, and the oddities piled up. A receipt for a coffee shop I'd never heard of, tucked in her coat pocket. A faint scent on her scarf that wasn't lavender. Something sharper, like citrus and smoke. I started paying attention, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't stop. She'd leave her phone face down now, a habit she'd never had before. Once, when it buzzed late at night, I reached for it out of instinct. She snatched it away so fast I froze, her laugh too high-pitched as she said, "Just spam." My stomach twisted, but I said nothing. I didn't want to be that husband, the paranoid one who checks texts and stalks shadows. Still, the seed was planted, and it grew roots I couldn't ignore. I'm not proud of what I did next, but doubt is a relentless thing. It gnaws at you, hollows out the spaces where certainty used to live. I started watching Clara more closely, cataloging her habits like I'd analyze a building's stress points. She'd always been a creature of spontaneity, but now her chaos felt deliberate. She'd vanish for hours with vague explanations. Errands, she'd say, or a sudden urge to sketch by the river. Her sketchbook, though, stayed untouched on her desk, pages blank as the day I'd bought it for her birthday. I'd ask how her day went, and she'd spin tales of quirky clients and tight deadlines. Her words too polished, too rehearsed. One night I couldn't take it anymore. She'd gone to bed early, claiming a headache, and left her phone charging in the kitchen. My hands shook as I picked it up, her passcode, our anniversary, unlocking a world I wasn't ready for. No explicit messages, no smoking gun, but there were texts from a number she hadn't saved. "Meet me at the usual spot." One read, time-stamped from the day she'd disappeared without a note. Another, "You're incredible. Can't stop thinking about it." My chest tightened, breath shallow, as I scrolled. She'd replied with emojis, hearts, a winking face, things she hadn't sent me in years. I set the phone down, hands cold, and stared at the wall until dawn. The next day I followed her. It felt wrong, tailing my own wife like some cheap detective, but I had to know. She left in the afternoon, dressed in a skirt I hadn't seen before, short and bold, nothing like her usual jeans and sweaters. I kept my distance, driving my truck 2 cars behind hers, my heart pounding as she turned into a residential neighborhood I didn't recognize. She parked outside a modern townhouse, all glass and sharp angles, and disappeared inside. I waited, engine idling, until a man stepped out to greet her. A tall guy, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a smile I'd never earned from her. They embraced, her arms lingering too long, and vanished through the door together. I sat there for an hour, maybe two, my mind a storm of jagged thoughts. Who was he? How long had this been going on? The betrayal wasn't just in the act. It was the intimacy, the ease between them, the way she'd given him a piece of herself I'd thought was mine alone. I drove home in a daze, the house suffocatingly silent. That night, she came back humming, radiant, and kissed me on the cheek like nothing had changed. I smiled back, my jaw tight, and started planning. Not confrontation, not yet. I needed proof, something undeniable, before I'd let her see the fracture she'd caused. Proof became my obsession. I couldn't confront Clara with half-formed suspicions. She'd twist it, paint me as the villain, the insecure husband who couldn't trust her. No, I needed evidence so solid it'd crush any excuse she could muster. I bought a small GPS tracker, the kind contractors use for equipment, and slipped it into the lining of her purse one morning while she showered. Felt dirty, invasive, but so did her lies. The app on my phone pinged her location that afternoon. Not her studio, not the river, but that same townhouse. She stayed there for 3 hours, long enough for my imagination to run wild with scenes I couldn't unsee. I dug deeper. The man's name was Ethan Caldwell, a real estate developer I found through a quick search of the property records. Mid-30s, unmarried, with a reputation for flipping houses and charming clients. His social media was polished. Photos of him at galas, grinning with a glass of wine, the kind of guy who thrived on attention. Clara's name popped up in a comment once. A playful jab about a late-night brainstorming session. My stomach churned. I cross-referenced her client meetings with his posts. Too many overlapped, dates and times aligning like a cruel puzzle snapping into place. I installed a voice recorder in her car, hidden under the passenger seat. The first few days were mundane. Grocery lists, her singing off-key to the radio. But then I hit gold. Her voice, soft and conspiratorial, on a call. I told him it's just work. He doesn't suspect a thing. Pause, then Ethan's laugh, low and warm. You're a genius, Clara. See you tonight. The recording cut off, but the words looped in my head, each one a blade. She wasn't just meeting him. She was hiding him, weaving him into our life like a parasite. That night, I watched her sleep, her face serene, and felt a rage I didn't recognize. This wasn't the woman I'd married, or maybe it was, and I'd been too blind to see it. I didn't wake her, didn't scream. Instead, I started sketching my own blueprint, not for a building, but for revenge. It had to be slow, deliberate, something that'd strip her of everything she'd gained from this. I'd make her feel the weight of her choices, and Ethan too. They'd built their little world on my trust. I'd tear it down brick by brick. The plan took shape over weeks, a quiet fury fueling every step. I didn't want a messy scene, no shouting matches or slammed doors. That'd be too easy for her to spin into a story of my failings. No, this had to be surgical, a collapse so complete she'd never recover the pieces. I started with Ethan. He was the key, the outsider who'd trespassed into my life. If I could dismantle him first, Clara's foundation would crumble too. I dug into his world, his business, his habits, his weaknesses. Real estate's a game of trust, and I'd make sure his crumbled. I posed as a potential investor using a burner email and a fake name, James Carter, a persona I crafted with a LinkedIn profile and a few doctored photos. Ethan bit fast, eager for a cash infusion on a condo project he was pitching. We met at a bar downtown, his handshake firm, his grin too wide. Up close, he reeked of cologne and confidence. The kind of man who thought charm could pave over any flaw. I played along, nodding at his spiel, asking just enough questions to keep him talking. "You've got a good eye," he said, clapping my shoulder. "We'll make a killing." I smiled, imagining his face when the rug came out from under him. Back home, I fed Clara half-truths to mirror her own game. "Met a new client today," I'd say, watching her perk up, oblivious that I was weaving my own web. She'd nod, distracted, her mind clearly elsewhere. Probably with him. I kept the GPS active, tracking her visits to Ethan's place. A rhythm so predictable it was almost laughable. Twice a week, like clockwork, she'd slip away, her excuses growing thinner. Book club, she'd say, or a friend's art show. I'd grunt, pretending to buy it, while the recorder in her car captured whispers and laughter that weren't meant for me. The real breakthrough came when I accessed Ethan's project files. A contact from my engineering days owed me a favor, a hacker type who could crack passwords like they were locks. He got me into Ethan's cloud storage, a treasure trove of contracts, emails, and financials. There it was. Sloppy bookkeeping, corners cut on permits, a trail of shady loans. Ethan wasn't just cheating with my wife, he was cheating the system. I saved everything, every damning byte, and started plotting how to weaponize it. This wasn't about ruining him fast, it was about letting him climb higher so the fall would break him completely. Clara noticed I was different, though she couldn't pin it down. "You're quiet lately," she said one morning over coffee, her tone casual but her eyes searching. I shrugged, stirring my mug, and mumbled something about work stress. She didn't push. Maybe she didn't want to risk me asking questions back. Her ignorance was my advantage. She thought I was still the predictable husband, plodding along while she danced her double life. I let her believe it, every nod and forced smile a brick in the wall I was building around her. I escalated with Ethan. As James Carter, I wired him a modest investment, 10 grand, enough to hook him without raising flags. He was ecstatic, emailing me updates on the condo project, blueprints I knew were flawed from my own expertise. I fed him encouragement, nudging him to take bigger risks, to leverage more debt. "Go big or go home," I wrote, and he ate it up, oblivious that I was luring him into a trap. Meanwhile, I tipped off a local inspector anonymously, pointing them toward Ethan's shortcuts. The dominoes were lining up, ready to topple. At home, I mirrored Clara's detachment. I stopped asking where she went, stopped kissing her goodnight. She didn't seem to mind. Her focus was elsewhere, her phone buzzing more than ever. Once, I caught her texting in the bathroom. The door cracked open, her fingers flying over the screen. She didn't see me watching, didn't hear the silent vow I made to turn her joy into ash. The recorder caught more, her voice dreamy as she told Ethan, "I've never felt this alive." I played it back alone, the words searing, and vowed she'd feel the opposite soon enough. By mid-December, Ethan's project was teetering. The inspection flagged violations, faulty wiring, unpermitted changes, and fines piled up. He emailed James in a panic, begging for more cash. I promised a meeting, then ghosted him, letting him scramble. Clara came home rattled that week, her usual glow dimmed. "Rough day?" I asked, feigning concern. She nodded, vague, and I hid my satisfaction. The revenge was unfolding, slow and cold, and they had no idea how deep it had cut. I wasn't done, not even close. Winter settled over the town like a shroud, mirroring the chill that had taken root in me. Clara's absences grew bolder. She'd leave without excuses now, her purse slung over her shoulder, a faint hum on her lips as she walked out the door. The GPS tracker pinged Ethan's townhouse again and again, a heartbeat I couldn't escape. I'd sit in my study, staring at the dot on my phone, imagining her laughter filling his space instead of ours. The recorder caught snippets, her voice teasing, his low and conspiratorial, but it wasn't enough anymore. I needed to see it, to burn the truth into my eyes so I could fuel the fire I was stoking. I rented a car, a nondescript sedan, and parked down the street from Ethan's place one frigid evening. The lights in his townhouse glowed warm against the snow-dusted street, a mockery of the cold I felt. Clara's car was there, tucked beside his SUV, and I watched as shadows moved behind the curtains. Then the front door opened, and there she was, my wife, bundled in a coat I'd bought her, stepping onto the porch. Ethan followed, his arms sliding around her waist, pulling her close. She tilted her face up, and they kissed, long and unhurried, right there in the open. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white, but I didn't look away. I let it sear into me, every second a promise of what I'd repay. I drove home shaking, not from the cold but from the clarity it brought. This wasn't a fling. It was a life she'd built behind my back, a betrayal so brazen it mocked everything we'd been. I spent that night in the basement, pulling out old photos, our wedding, vacations, her smiling at me like I was her world. I tore them into strips, methodical, the sound of ripping paper drowning out the ache. Revenge wasn't just a want now, it was a need, a structure I'd design with the same precision I gave to bridges and beams. They'd feel it, both of them, in ways they couldn't imagine. The next day, I upped the ante with Ethan. His project was crumbling, inspectors crawling over the site, investors pulling out, but he didn't know I was the ghost behind it. I leaked his financials to a local blogger, a guy I knew from college who loved a juicy scoop. Anonymous tip, I wrote, attaching files that showed Ethan's loans, his fudged numbers, his desperation. Within 48 hours, the story broke online. Developer's dream turns nightmare. Ethan's phone must have lit up with panicked calls. But I wasn't done. I wanted him to taste ruin before I turned to Clara. Clara came home late that night, her face drawn, eyes darting like she sensed the walls closing in. Something wrong? I asked, my voice flat as I chopped vegetables for a dinner she'd barely touch. She hesitated, then shook her head. Just tired, she said, disappearing upstairs. I heard the shower run, longer than usual, and wondered if she was washing him off her skin. The thought twisted in me, but I kept my mask on, distant, preoccupied, the husband she'd stopped noticing. She didn't know I'd seen her with Ethan, didn't know I was pulling levers she couldn't see. Ethan's downfall accelerated. The blog post sparked a firestorm. Creditors hounded him, his permits were revoked, and whispers of fraud circled like vultures. I kept tabs through James Carter, feigning concern in emails while he unraveled. Rough break, I wrote, smirking as I hit send. He replied with desperation, begging for a bailout, but I let him dangle. Clara felt it too. Her phone buzzed less, her moods swinging between distracted and irritable. Once, she snapped at me over a spilled mug, her voice sharp, then apologized too quickly. I nodded, silent, filing it away. She was fraying, and I hadn't even touched her yet. I started planting seeds at home. Small things, leaving Ethan's name on a notepad, a casual mention of a developer in trouble I'd heard about at work. Her reactions were subtle but telling. A pause, a flicker in her eyes, a too quick change of subject. She was scared, I realized, not of me but of losing whatever she'd built with him. It was almost pitiful how little she saw coming. I let her stew, let the tension coil while I worked on the next phase. Ethan's ruin was satisfying, but Clara's would be personal. She'd betrayed me in our bed, our life, and I'd make her pay in kind. That weekend, I tailed her again. She met Ethan at a diner instead of his place, their booth in the back, heads bent close. He looked haggard, unshaven, his charm replaced by panic. She touched his hand, her face soft with worry, and I snapped photos through the window. Grainy, but clear enough. Evidence, yes, but also a reminder of why I was doing this. I'd use it later when the time was right. For now, I let them have their moment, their fragile little bubble. It had burst soon enough. Christmas loomed, and the house felt like a stage for a play neither of us believed in. Clara strung lights, baked cookies, her cheer forced and brittle. I played along, hanging ornaments, my smiles as hollow as hers. We didn't talk about the distance, it was a silent agreement, a truce built on lies. She didn't know I'd seen her with Ethan at the diner. Didn't know I'd heard her whisper his name in her sleep one night. I kept it locked inside, a pressure building, waiting for release. The holidays were a perfect cover. Everyone too busy to notice the storm brewing. Ethan's world was collapsing faster than I'd hoped. The blogger dug deeper, unearthing old clients he'd swindled, liens on properties he couldn't pay. His condo project halted, a skeleton of steel and concrete abandoned mid-build. I watched from afar, sipping coffee at a cafe across from his office, as movers hauled out furniture. Bankruptcy was close, I could smell it. Clara felt the ripple. She'd come home pale, her excuses replaced by silence. "You okay?" I'd ask, and she'd nod, eyes avoiding mine. I wondered if she blamed me somehow, if she sensed the noose tightening. I shifted focus to her. She'd always been proud of her art, her reputation as a creative force. I'd admired it too, her talent, her passion. But now it was a weapon. I contacted her biggest client, a publisher she'd worked with for years, posing as a concerned colleague. "She's been distracted," I said, voice low, regretful. "Missed deadlines, shaky quality. Thought you should know." They thanked me, promised discretion, and within days, I heard her on the phone, pleading, her voice cracking. "It's a misunderstanding," she said, but the damage was done. Her inbox slowed, her confidence wobbled. I watched her unravel, piece by piece, and felt no guilt, only justice. The photos from the diner sat on my laptop, a folder labeled taxes she'd never open. I printed one, slipped it into her sketchbook, and waited. She found it 2 days later. I heard her gasp from the kitchen, saw her rush upstairs, face ashen. "Everything all right?" I called casual. She didn't answer, just shut herself in her studio. I didn't push. The seed was planted, paranoia blooming. She'd wonder who'd taken it, how much I knew. I let her sit with it, let it fester, while I planned the next blow. New Year's Eve brought a false truce. Clara insisted on a party. Friends, neighbors, a crowd to drown the silence between us. I agreed, playing the genial host, shaking hands while she flitted around, her laugh too loud, her wine glass never empty. Ethan wasn't there, of course. He was persona non grata now, his name a whisper among the gossips. I overheard someone mention his collapse, saw Clara stiffen across the room. Our eyes met, and for a moment, I thought she'd crack, spill everything. But she turned away, sipping her drink, and I let her hide. The night ended with fireworks, her leaning against me like old times, but I felt nothing. Only the cold resolve of what came next. Her career took the hit I'd engineered. The publisher dropped her, citing reliability issues, and smaller clients followed. Spooked by Rumo RS, I'd nudged along. She spent hours in her studio, sketching furiously, but the spark was gone. Her hands trembled, her lines uncertain. I'd catch her staring at blank pages, lost, and say nothing. She'd built her identity on her art. I'd strip it away, leave her bare. Ethan's calls stopped too. The recorder picked up her leaving voicemails, her tone pleading. "We can fix this," she'd say, but he never answered. I'd severed them, isolated her, and she didn't even know it was me. I escalated with Ethan's ruin. Using James Carter, I fed a final blow, forged documents suggesting he'd embezzled from past partners. I sent them to his lawyer, his bank, let the legal wolves descend. He was arrested on a gray January morning, cuffs glinting as cameras flashed. The news hit online, and Clara saw it. She locked herself in the bathroom, sobs echoing through the door. I knocked, feigning worry. "What's wrong?" She emerged red-eyed, muttering about a friend in trouble, and I nodded, hiding my triumph. He was gone, and she was next. I started breaking her world at home. Little things, her favorite mug, accidentally shattered. Her lavender lotion replaced with a scent she hated. She'd frown, confused, but wouldn't ask. I moved her sketchbook, her pencils, let her search in frustration. Once, I left the photo from the diner on the counter, watched her freeze, then claim it was nothing. Her lies were crumbling, her grip slipping, and I savored it. The revenge was close now, a storm ready to break. January dragged on, gray and relentless, and Clara became a ghost in our house. She barely ate, her frame thinning, her auburn hair dull and unwashed. She'd sit by the window, staring at nothing, her phone silent in her lap. Ethan's arrest had gutted her. She didn't say it, but I saw it in the way she flinched at every headline, every knock on the door. I kept up the charade, cooking dinners she ignored, asking about her day with a tone so neutral it cut. She'd mumble responses, her eyes hollow, and I'd nod, letting her sink deeper into the pit I'd dug. Her art dried up completely. The last client, a small gallery, canceled a show she'd pinned her hopes on. Another quiet nudge from me, a whispered doubt about her stability. She got the email while I was in the room, her face crumpling as she read it. "I don't understand," she whispered, more to herself than me. I shrugged, flipping through a magazine. "Maybe it's time for a break," I said, and she looked at me like I'd slapped her. Good. Let her feel the weight of nothing where something used to be. I tightened the screws. I canceled her credit cards, claiming a security breach, and watched her panic when they declined at the store. "I'll fix it," I said, but I didn't let her scramble with cash she barely had. I changed the Wi-Fi password, locking her out of her online world, her lifeline to Ethan's updates. She'd fumble with her laptop, frustration mounting, and I'd play dumb. "Tech's not my thing, Clara." She stopped asking, stopped fighting, her spirit eroding under the slow drip of my sabotage. The final piece was ready. I'd saved the recorder's best clip, her laughing with Ethan, planning a weekend away, mocking my boring predictability. I waited until she was in the kitchen, then played it through a Bluetooth speaker, loud and clear. She froze, knife in hand, as her own voice filled the room. Her eyes met mine, wide with terror, and I smiled, just a small one, before walking out. She didn't follow, didn't speak. The silence was her confession and my signal. The endgame was here. The air in the house turned thick after I played the recording. Clara didn't confront me, didn't beg or explain. She just retreated, a shadow slipping into her studio or curling up in bed for hours. I didn't push. Her silence was louder than any excuse she could have spun. The truth hung between us, a fracture too wide to bridge, and I let it fester. She knew I knew, and that was enough for now. I'd spent months building this cage around her. Her career in tatters, Ethan gone, her confidence shattered, and the walls were closing in. But I wasn't done. The revenge had to be complete, a reckoning she'd carry forever. I started dismantling her sanctuary. Her studio, once a chaos of color and life, became my target. I'd slip in when she was out. Rare now, but she still left sometimes, maybe to chase ghosts of Ethan, and rearrange things. Her paints, meticulously organized, I'd mix into muddy smears, claiming a leak ruined them. Her sketches, I'd crumple or soak, leaving them in piles she'd find with a gasp. "The cat must have gotten in," I'd say, knowing we didn't have one. Her eyes would narrow, suspicion flickering, but she never accused me. She couldn't. Doubt had eaten her certainty away. I took it further. Her portfolio, the digital archive of her best work, I accidentally deleted from her laptop, overwriting backups with junk files. She spent a day trying to recover it, her sobs echoing through the house, and I watched from the doorway, silent. "I told you to back it up somewhere else," I said, my tone cold. She didn't respond, just stared at the screen, hands trembling. Her art was her soul, and I'd ripped it out, piece by piece. She stopped drawing after that, the pencils gathering dust, her spirit as blank as the pages she'd once filled. Friends noticed her decline. Phone calls came, concerned voices asking if she was okay. I'd answer, calm and vague, "She's just taking some time off." They'd offer to visit, and I'd deflect, saying she wasn't up for it. Isolation was my final gift to her. She'd built a life outside me with Ethan, so I'd make sure she had nothing left. The invitations stopped, the voices faded, and she didn't fight it. She was a husk now, moving through the house like a guest who'd overstayed, and I savored every hollow step. February brought a bitter cold, and with it, the next phase. Clara's birthday was the 14th, Valentine's Day, a cruel irony now. She'd always loved it, the romance, the attention, but this year, I'd turn it into a blade. I planned a surprise, a twisted echo of the celebrations we'd once shared. I cooked her favorite meal, roast lamb, rosemary wafting through the house, and set the table with candles, her favorite wine. She shuffled downstairs, wary, her hair a mess, eyes sunken. "What's this?" she asked, voice small. "For you," I said, smiling too wide. She sat, uncertain, and I watched her pick at the food, barely tasting it. Mid-meal, I handed her a gift, a small box wrapped in red paper. She opened it slowly, fingers fumbling, and found a USB drive. "What's this?" she whispered. "Play it," I said, nodding to her laptop. She hesitated, then plugged it in, and the screen filled with a slideshow, photos of her and Ethan. The diner kiss, her car at his place, blurry shots I'd taken over months. Her breath hitched, face paling as the images looped, a silent accusation. "Thought you'd want a keepsake," I said, leaning back. She didn't cry, didn't scream, just stared, hands clasped tight, as the candles flickered. I left her there, the food cold, the slideshow running, and went upstairs. Hours later, I found her still at the table, eyes fixed on the screen, the wine untouched. She didn't look at me, didn't speak, and I didn't care. The gift wasn't just the pictures. It was the permanence, the proof she couldn't erase. She'd see it every time she closed her eyes, a memory I'd branded into her. The next day, she didn't leave her room, and I didn't check. The house was mine now, her presence a fading echo I'd soon silence. Ethan's fate sealed the backdrop. His trial started, fraud charges stacking up, and the news ran his mugshot, haggard, defeated. I clipped the article, left it on the counter for her to find. She did, her gasp audible from the hall, and I smiled to myself. He'd get years, maybe a decade, and she'd know I'd orchestrated it. Not directly. She'd never prove it. But the timing, the precision would whisper my hand. She was alone now, truly alone, and I was ready for the final act. March arrived, and Clara was a specter. Thin, silent, her lavender scent replaced by stale air. She barely left her room, emerging only for water or to sit by the window, staring at a world she'd lost. I'd taken everything. Her lover, her art, her pride. But it wasn't enough. Revenge isn't just about breaking someone. It's about making them feel the void where their life used to be. I'd saved the cruelest stroke for last, a finale that'd leave her with nothing to rebuild from. It required patience, a steady hand, and I had both. I started with the house. It was ours, legally, but hers emotionally. The creaky floors, the wide windows, the studio she'd once ruled. I contacted a realtor, posing as a concerned husband selling for her health. "She needs a fresh start," I said, and they nodded, eager for the commission. I listed it quietly, no sign out front, and waited. Clara didn't notice the emails, the appraisals I scheduled when she was asleep or too lost to care. The offer came fast. A young couple, cash in hand, and I accepted, signing papers in secret. She'd wake up one day to movers, to a life uprooted, and I'd be the one holding the shovel. I drained our joint accounts next. Small transfers at first, then bigger ones, funneled into a new account she couldn't touch. I'd tell her it was investments. Let her wonder why the cards kept declining. She'd stopped shopping, stopped caring, but the humiliation would sting when she tried. I sold her car too, claimed it was repossessed after I stopped payments, and watched her confusion as it vanished from the driveway. "Bank must have messed up," I said, shrugging. She didn't argue, just nodded, her fight gone. Every loss was a cut, shallow but precise, bleeding her dry. The endgame loomed. I packed my things. Clothes, tools, the life I'd reclaim, and left hers untouched, a museum of her ruin. I wrote a note, simple and cold. "I know everything. Goodbye." I'd leave it with the photos, the article, the USB, a package of her betrayal to greet her when I was gone. She'd have no home, no money, no me, just the wreckage I'd crafted. The movers were set, the sale final. I'd walk away, and she'd collapse in the dust. The day came, a crisp Saturday, the sky too blue for what I'd planned. I woke early, made coffee, and watched Clara shuffle downstairs, her robe hanging loose, eyes vacant. She didn't speak, just sat with her mug, steam curling around her like a ghost. I timed it perfectly. The movers would arrive at noon, the realtor at 1. My bags were in the truck, hidden under a tarp, ready for my exit. I'd rented a cabin upstate, a new start where she'd never find me. She didn't suspect. How could she, when she'd stopped seeing me at all? At 11:45, I left the note on the counter, the photos and USB beside it, the article pinned under a mug. I heard the rumble of the moving truck, tires crunching gravel, and stepped outside. "We're here for the pickup," the driver said, and I nodded, pointing them in. Clara emerged, confused, as men in coveralls streamed past, hauling furniture. Our sofa, her desk, the bed we'd shared. "What's happening?" she croaked, voice raw. I met her eyes, calm and unyielding. "House is sold. I'm leaving." Her mouth opened, but no sound came, just a wheeze, like air escaping a puncture. She stumbled to the counter, saw the note, the evidence, and froze. The movers kept working, oblivious, as she flipped through the photos, hands shaking. "You did this?" she whispered, barely audible. I didn't answer, just watched her process it, the sale, Ethan's fall, her ruin. The realtor arrived, a perky woman in a blazer, and handed me the final papers. "All set, Mr. Grayson," she chirped. Clara stared, uncomprehending as I signed. The movers finished, the house half empty, and I grabbed my keys. "Take care," I said, my last words to her, and walked out. She didn't follow, didn't scream, just stood there, a statue in the chaos I'd made. I drove off, the house shrinking in the rearview, her silhouette in the doorway the last I'd see. The cabin was hours away, but I didn't rush. Let the road stretch, the weight lifting with every mile. She'd have no money, no home, no one. The bank would call soon, the locks would change, and she'd be alone with her choices. I'd built her a prison of nothing, and I'd locked the door. The cabin was quiet. A wood stove hummed the only sound as I settled in. No neighbors, no past. Just trees and a lake, a blank slate I'd earned. I'd kept tabs through a friend. Clara had stayed in town, crashing with a cousin who'd taken pity. The house sold fast, the new couple oblivious to its ghosts. Her accounts were empty, her car gone, her art a memory. Ethan got 8 years, his name mud, and she'd visited him once. A brief meeting behind glass that ended in tears. She was broken, fully, and I felt no remorse. Only a strange peace, like a project completed to spec. I unpacked slowly, my tools first, hammers, levels, the things that made sense. The phone stayed off. No one needed to reach me. I'd heard she tried calling, left voicemails I'd never play. Her voice didn't belong here. The cousin said she'd stopped talking much, just sat by a window, sketching nothing on napkins. Her world had shrunk to a pinpoint, and I'd put it there. The betrayal, her lips on his, her lies in our bed, had demanded this, and I'd delivered. Not with fists or shouts, but with a slow, cold unraveling she couldn't escape. Spring came, and I built a porch, wood creaking under my hands. The lake glittered, indifferent, and I thought of her less, her face fading, her lavender sent a distant whiff. I'd won not by keeping her, but by letting her go into the void. She'd live with it. Every empty day a mirror of what she'd done. I didn't need to see it. Knowing was enough. The revenge was cruel, yes, but fitting, a structure of loss as precise as any I'd engineered. I'd moved on, whole, while she'd stay fractured. A cautionary tale in the wreckage I'd left behind. Months later, a letter came. No return address, her shaky handwriting. "I'm sorry," it read, nothing more. I burned it in the stove, watched the flames eat her words, and felt nothing. The story was over, the blueprint executed. I poured a drink, sat on the porch and listened to the silence. Mine now and mine alone.